Hello and welcome to Decision NYC with Ben Max. I'm Ben Max, your host and the executive editor of Gotham Gazette. The 2021 New York City election season is well underway and it's poised to be the most significant municipal election in decades. All of city government is on the ballot, and because so few incumbents are eligible to run for their current seats due to term limits, New Yorkers are electing many new office holders and the next roster of leadership for our city. There will be a new mayor of New York City elected here in 2021, as well as a new city controller, several new borough presidents, and many new city council members. And that's not all that's on the ballot. A number of incumbents are eligible for and seeking re-election, including the city's public advocate. And there's a very crowded and competitive race for Manhattan District Attorney and more. Party primaries are set for June, and the general election in the fall will culminate on November 2nd. This is the first full set of municipal elections that will feature both early voting and a new ranked choice voting system that applies only to party primaries and special elections, and will have a separate show just on ranked choice voting. This city election cycle would be of enormous importance under more usual circumstances, but it's unfolding at a time of great crisis for our city, raising the stakes of the decisions that you, the voter, will make. The new wave of city leadership will quite clearly make or break the city's recovery from the devastation of the COVID-19 pandemic and its many impacts on health, family, job, city government finances, education, housing, and much more. It's also important to note, though, that there were several major crises facing the city well before the pandemic, and those haven't gone anywhere. In fact, some are worse now because of it. So it's an important time of choosing here in New York City, and we're pleased to bring you this new series of interviews with candidates running for citywide offices, mayor, public advocate, controller, as well as interviews with candidates for other offices. And there will be debates. These one-on-one conversations, though, will help you get to know the candidates, learn about their backgrounds, their resumes, their platforms, their vision for the city and the office they are seeking. We hope this and other interviews will help you sort through your many choices and make an informed decision when it's time to vote. So today we're focused on the position of New York City Comptroller. The Comptroller is a citywide elected office and considered the city's independently elected chief fiscal officer and budget watchdog. The Comptroller evaluates most city contracts with outside entities, audits city agencies to find waste and inefficiency, and makes recommendations and proposals to improve city government and other services that New Yorkers rely on. And the Comptroller is importantly a fiduciary to the city's 5 public pension funds that total approximately $240 billion in assets and retirees rely on. So let's get to today's conversation with a candidate for the office of New York City Comptroller. City Councilmember Brad Lander is a Democrat running to be the next Comptroller. Councilmember Lander, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's great to be with you. Thank you for doing this series.
Sure. Thanks for taking the time. So before we get into your platform for Comptroller and issues facing the city, a little bit about your background, your resume, your past work, and what has brought you to this moment in time.
Thank you so much. So as you rightly say, this moment is one of the greatest crises in any of our lifetimes, maybe in our city's history. And you just look out your window and you see families waiting in line for food, so many people facing eviction, so many small businesses struggling. And those of us who love our neighborhoods and who love our city feel called to first get our hands around the pandemic, get the vaccine distributed, help save the lives of our neighbors. And then alongside that, we need to build a just and durable recovery that gets us ready for future crises, including the climate crisis, and also responds to the painful economic and racial inequalities that this crisis has so clearly revealed. And I've been working on those issues my whole adult life. I live in Park Slope, in the neighborhood where I first started working at age 23 at a community-based organization called the Fifth Avenue Committee. And I became the director of a group that works on affordable housing, fighting for tenants' rights, helping small businesses in the area. At the time, it's hard to remember, but there were 150 abandoned buildings and 150 vacant lots in the neighborhood. And I rolled up my sleeves along with my neighbors. They had created this community organization in the 1970s to both bring the neighborhood back, but also make it work for everyone. And I built an organization, I found an organization that had 5 staff and built it up to 50 staff We renovated buildings to preserve or create 500 units of affordable housing, helped dozens and dozens of small businesses, fought alongside thousands of tenants so people could stay in the neighborhood, and created new businesses, new programs for job creation, helping some folks come back from prison or jail to the neighborhood so they could succeed and thrive. And so, all these years later, as we're working on the future of Gowanus and community planning, when we brought participatory budgeting to the city, that's all grounded in my belief in community planning and engaging neighborhood residents and leaders, but also taking a really good hard look at the data so that the voice and vision of residents can be combined with a real honest take on what government can do, how it works in partnership with communities to build a thriving city. So I did that work for 10 years. I continued that work at the Pratt Center for Community Development for 5 years, working with community groups in all 5 boroughs: economic justice, environmental justice, community planning and preservation. And then decided in 2009 to run for city council. And the last decade, I've been working in the council trying to make the city work better for exactly the people that I met fighting for our neighborhood and all neighborhoods.
And a couple of highlights of that tenure. Do you want to point people to a couple pieces of legislation you've passed that you're most proud of? Obviously, being in the council for as long as you've been in the council, there's a lot that's gotten done, but a few highlights that you would point people to.
Absolutely. I mean, let me tell one story because I feel like the work I've done with fast food workers in many ways spans over that whole time. Way back in my first term, I got called to an action when fast food workers were starting to strike because at the time they earned $7.25 an hour. They didn't have paid sick leave. They had totally erratic schedules, couldn't get full-time jobs if they wanted them, and could be fired for no reason at all. And I joined some of the first Fight for 15 strikes. And in those first strikes, a few workers got fired. And one worker named Edwin, who worked in a fast food restaurant on 4th Avenue in my district, got fired as a result. And so he and others asked me to walk back in with him the first day he was trying to go back to work and talk to his boss and say, you shouldn't fire Edwin. He wants to do a good job and make this a good job. And sure enough, I did that. The boss took him back as a result of it. And that started to build a partnership with those fast food workers so that I worked with them to win the paid sick leave law in my first term in the council, worked with them to win a $15 hour minimum wage that came from the state, but through a campaign we organized together. And then 2 pieces of legislation I've passed. One that gave them a stable, fair work week and the pathway to a full-time job with 2 weeks advance notice of their schedules. And just recently, we passed a law that protect workers from unfair firing. There has to be a good reason, what it's called a just cause. And over the decade, we've transformed jobs through their organizing and our legislating that you could not sustain a family on, that you didn't know if you would have, that you couldn't make better, into something that, fast food workers are not getting rich, but at $15 an hour with 2 weeks advance notice of your schedule, with a pathway to full-time work, with paid sick leave, and now with workplace protections, you can have some stability even in this city. And I've done things like that in a lot of areas, a lot of work on police accountability with public advocate Jumaane Williams, a lot of work on tenants' rights, some work on school integration that I'd be glad to talk about more. And then finally, a lot of work on making government work better. Because all those promises are good, but if we don't make government work better, it can't deliver on any of its promises. So I've taken aggressive oversight on transportation, on capital projects management, and a range of other areas. And that really is the lens I'm planning to bring to the Comptroller's office, not just helping government do big things, but holding it to account for living up to its promises.
The Comptroller's office has in the neighborhood of 800 employees, accountants, economists, budget analysts, investment professionals, and a variety of others. How does your management experience prepare you for that? This is actually a field with candidates who are, some of whom are elected officials in individual districts. Those offices typically have, roughly maybe 10 employees. What about the jump to managing an office of that size with citywide responsibilities?
It's a great question and an important one. So first, as I mentioned, I've led 2 nonprofits. The 5th Avenue Committee, as I said, when I started, had 5 staff and I grew it to 50. And that meant fundraising, that meant careful oversight and planning and growth, that meant being audited and overseeing audits every year. So we grew stably. Then I led the Pratt Center for Community Development, where we conducted policy research on many of the same policies that I do in the city council. I was one of the first people to call for reform of the 421A tax break program, for changes in some of our zoning laws, by overseeing staff that do research exactly like folks do in the controller's office. And for the last 10 years in the city council, I've played a strong oversight role digging inside the city's now $90 billion expense budget, its $100 billion capital budget. And I think I've built a track record for getting down into the weeds, working with the folks who know what the numbers are, getting real information, and then partnering with people, both to hold the administration to account, to focus on what matters, and to build the kind of teams that get change made. It's not only doing those audits, it's making sure that there's results out of them. And I've hired just great staff. I feel lucky. Several of my former staff are running for city council now, so maybe you'll talk to them in city council interviews. We have built great teams that do really powerful work throughout the council. So I'll be able to come in on day one, work with the staff in the controller's office that will be staying, and then build our team up to do all the functions. And you're right. The controller's office is the fiduciary for the pension funds, oversees the audit, does the city's certified financial audit every year, oversees contracts, enforces prevailing wage, settles settlements against the city in lawsuits. That takes a really diverse array of skills. There is no one person who has all that professional experience. What you want is someone who can build a team to get it done. There's a reason we elect the office instead of hiring experts for each of those tasks, right? We could hire an expert accountant to do the city's books. We could hire an expert financial manager to be the fiduciary for the city's pension funds, and on and on and on down the line. But what we want is someone who shares the vision and values of New Yorkers, so that the task of accountability is a shared one, where we're saying we share the vision and values of New Yorkers. We collectively have to hold our city government to its promises. We want to elect someone who's got the experience and the chops to do that.
Do you share the vision and values of New Yorkers writ large, or do you share the vision and values of a significant portion of the Democratic primary that likes a Brad Lander candidacy?
Well, I believe that as New Yorkers, we share some pretty fundamental values. Obviously, there's big difference of agreement on everything in America, and certainly on New York City. There were a lot of different opinions in the presidential race. Different opinions are totally appropriate. But here's what I mean when I say share vision and values. First, we need to recover from the COVID crisis. So we want to save the lives of our neighbors. We need to get vaccine distributed in a way that's far more equitable than it is. And we need to do that quickly and transparently so that we can save lives and open our city back up. And there may be disagreements on some pieces about how to do that, but everybody's got that for a vision. Then we need a just and durable recovery that gets our economy open up again, so that especially our small businesses, but the economy in general starts flourishing, and people can earn so that they can pay their rent and not be evicted and made homeless. In this crisis, we have seen just devastating racial inequalities by neighborhood, meaning that Black and Latino New Yorkers have been twice as likely to die from COVID as you and I, as their white neighbors. And nobody thinks that that is right. So we have to build a city that's more just and equal. And I think we all want a city that is more prepared for the future, for future crises, than we were for this one. We did not manage to see the COVID crisis coming, and we've paid in 27,000 lives as a result. So we can be more ready for future crises. All of that is shared broadly by New Yorkers, regardless of party, regardless of neighborhood, regardless of race.
So let's talk about the preparation or the lack thereof. The COVID crisis is a once in a century pandemic. Obviously, it's impossible to argue that the federal government handled it well, but let's home in here on the city finances and city budgeting and some of the problems with city budgeting and finances that were sort of exposed here. The city budget probably wasn't in any way, shape, or form going to be ready for this type of hit, no matter what. But we're fundamental problems with the way the city budget and city finances have been done over the last decade, let's say? Have they been exposed right now? Are there fundamental issues, COVID or no COVID, that are really troubling and haven't been addressed but need to be, that you would fight for as controller?
Yes. Well, let me give an example of one thing I think that this showed we got wrong. Maybe two things we got wrong and one thing we got right. We've seen a big increase in COVID around the intersections of mental health and homelessness. COVID has pushed a lot of people out of work, and you see more people on the street. The governor made a decision that I didn't agree with at the time, but I sure don't agree with in hindsight, to close subways overnight, and that pushed more folks from who were spending the night in the subways up onto the streets. And we don't have a mental health response and a homelessness response that is as good as it need to be. Both of those ballooned in numbers in recent years. The mayor established the Thrive NYC program, $850 million, but it was not held sufficiently accountable for results. In many ways, it bypassed the existing mental health infrastructure. So it added costs without really significantly improving our ability to respond. And the same on homelessness. We have spent so much more money, and I believe we should have a right to shelter. So we have to spend what it takes, but we could be doing that in much smarter ways that built a better path from the shelter into permanent supportive housing and more effectively help people get off the streets in the first place. And so absolutely, the controller, but I'll give one example of something we did right too, because I do think Saving the Health and Hospitals Corporation, Mitch Katz coming in, and instead in other cities, what might have been done, which was taking an austerity approach and shutting down public hospitals, as has happened in so many other places, a decision was made here to invest in them. And that has saved a lot of lives, especially in the hardest hit communities, least likely to be served by private hospitals. And so I think that's one example of something we got right.
So you got at a couple of sort of programmatic areas that obviously also go to spending, waste management. But in terms of the budget, the city budget sort of structurally, are there big changes that are needed to be made? Was city spending allowed to grow way too fast and way too big? There were significant reserves, of course, that have been relied on during this crisis. And like I said, this is not, the size of this crisis was probably not going to be able to be handled by the city no matter what, without major federal help. But were there fundamental issues with the city finances and the city budget that need to be addressed here going forward?
Yes, absolutely. So first, the city has not had a rainy day fund that every year you put money in to save for a crisis, for a rainy day. That required changing the charter and authorizing it in Albany. Those things should have been done decades ago, really should have been done out of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. We're finally voting to do those now, but it's when the crisis is already here. We should have done them in the past. We must do them in the future. We need to commit every year that as the budget starts to get better, that we target and put money in that account. As controller, I'll every year say how much I think it needs to be, evaluate it sufficiently, and get us ready for future crises more than we were now. Headcount growth is a little more complicated. You have to drill down and look at where it went. The biggest single area of headcount growth in the time that the de Blasio administration has been in office is the universal pre-K and 3K programs. And that takes teachers. You can't expand and give all 4-year-olds a great access to school without hiring up a lot of teachers. So some of my opponents just cite headcount growth and budget growth as though all of it is willy-nilly. We need a controller who's really going to look in detail and take a sharper scalpel. I agree that this administration should have done what are called PEG programs to eliminate the gap, to drill down on particular agencies, because some programs get out of date and you just keep them going because you always have them, even though they've been passed by. Some programs you start and they're not working, like Thrive NYC. But some things you start and they take more staff, like giving all our 3 and 4-year-olds a real chance. And we want to make those investments. So I'll look hard at the budget, but I want to do it with a commitment to investing in our city's future thriving, not just tightening belts for the sake of it in ways that put people in harm's way.
You're running in part on your familiarity with the city budget. From where you sit now, do you know which departments you think are the most bloated, have the most waste, haven't really done enough evaluation to find those savings?
Sure. But one thing I do want to underline first that I think hasn't gotten enough attention for helping us get things on solid track is the plan that's underway right this year to only hire one new city employee for every 3 who leave. We already, the mayor reported, have brought headcount down by 7,000, and the projection is that doing that over the next year will bring it down by another 5,000. That's actually a really good check in a time like this. Obviously, there are things you must hire for if you're going to provide remote education and in-person education. You might need 2 teachers where you've only had 1 before. But if you ask the hard question with every staff, and this should be with NYPD officers as well as with teachers or parks workers or librarians, let's replace 1 in every 3 unless there is a real persuasive case that it is an emergency for the purposes of pandemic health. So I think that is a good, strong step. There are a lot of agencies it's important to look at. NYPD is certainly at the top of my list. There was not a hiring freeze at the NYPD last year. We hired more police officers, even as we had a freeze on teachers and sanitation workers and parks workers, and that did not make sense. The $11 billion we're spending on policing, we're not getting our money's worth. So that's one area. I would like to take a good hard look at, and I think it is probably time to end the 421A tax break program, which is $1.5 billion a year we spend for too little in return to new private development that in many cases doesn't even meet its affordable housing commitments. And then the controller has a watch list of agencies, and that includes Department of Homeless Services, NYCHA, Corrections. Those will all stay on my watch list. And the New York City Department of Education is our biggest agency by far. It's about 1/4 of the city's budget. I love our public schools. We're lucky to have them. We want to make them work better. In any agency that large, you have to look at outside contracts, at testing, at older programs. And really make sure we're getting our money's worth.
Yeah, and I think at the Department of Education, one of the biggest areas of growth has been at DOE headquarters, not in the schools as well. So that discussion ties in with where I wanted to go next, which was the audit function of the office. Are there things you would do differently? How would you upgrade that? Or is it running very smoothly and you're excited to take that over possibly? But are there ways you would approach auditing city agencies differently?
So I'm very passionate about auditing city agencies, which may not be everybody's idea of excitement, but I've put out a whole thorough plan. I hope folks will take a look on my website at landerfornyc.com. We've got a thorough plan for improving the function of the Audit Bureau of the Controller's Office to make New York City government work better. Partly that's making the audits more strategic. Right now, what I find is that they're just sort of a little all over the place. Maybe you're looking here at did everyone fill out their travel vouchers so I want to make audits in some themes. Waste, fraud, and abuse is one critical theme. Performance is one that we're not spending enough time on. What are the metrics by which we're measuring agency performance? And let's evaluate whether they're achieving their goals. That's an obvious category, but we don't do it as much as we should. There are new practices of what are called equity audits, where you're looking at around race and gender equity. How is this department doing in its contracting, in its hiring, but also in the impacts of its work? If Black and Latino families are more likely to have their kids removed than white families in the same situation, that's an audit function to look at those equity questions. I really, as you know, because you and I have talked about this before, care about looking more at capital projects management. We talk a lot about the operating budget, but we commit $10 billion a year on capital projects, and there's no audit team that looks at how do we bring those in on time and on budget. More than half of the projects aren't done that way. So we can save hundreds of millions of dollars, but also deliver infrastructure on time, which is critical, not only because we love our parks or we need new schools, but because we must get our city ready for the coming climate crisis. And that we can build a capital projects and infrastructure investment program that more efficiently creates good jobs, mitigates climate change, and gets us ready for the future.
I want to get to a couple more topics, and we're only about 5 minutes left, unfortunately. So I do want to try to get to a couple more things. One, though, relates to what you were just talking about, also the challenges with city contracting and getting the nonprofit sector that the city relies on paid on time, maybe even paid a little bit better. which you've worked on, but not really in the specific weeds of that. More broadly, why do things seem so broken in city government? What is the problem here where the capital budget is broken? City spending was probably going too fast without enough reserves put away. The contracting process is broken. There have been some really good boom times for a number of years. What's at the essence of this?
Oh, look, I think what's at the essence of it is that accountability is hard. And in a democracy, it's especially hard. Look, we all know this in our own lives. It's hard to hold ourselves accountable for the New Year's resolutions or commitments we make. We want to save weight, eat less, exercise more, be, kinder to our loved ones. And it's hard to hold yourself accountable. You make those promises in January, and if by February. So you need structures of accountability. And in a democracy, when we have, a government that gets built up over time, doing so many different things, of course, if you don't build in those structures of accountability, it's just going to keep kind of going without real check and balance. That's the whole purpose of this office. That's why we elected instead of hiring somebody from Wall Street.
Right.
I've tried to model that through participatory budgeting. I want to bring those tools of shared accountability into the office.
But as you get at there with the controller's office existing, the public advocate's office being there, the city council being there, the structures are in place. Are elected officials to go along and get along? What, can you promise people to come in as a controller who's not worried about, who endorsed you, and you're going to really
Yes.
get city government,
I think I can. So first of all, I'm not going to make an endorsement in the mayor's race. So I'm not going to owe anybody anything, and I will be independent. I'm the only candidate in the race who's not taking contributions from real estate developers, for-profit lobbyists, fossil fuel executives, private equity fund managers. I will be independent. And I believe that this is a practice of shared accountability. I want to work, and this I've done in the council with a whole wide array of community-based organizations, advocacy groups, folks who are working to make the city better, because accountability doesn't come when the controller produces an audit and it gets one story in the newspaper. It comes when you build an effort together of people demanding a particular kind of change with the data that shows what's needed. And that's what I've done. That's like how we won with those fast food workers. It's how we focused on school integration and changed an administration that was dead set against doing it. And we built up enough pressure on the outside with data from a law I passed on the inside to make change where it hadn't existed before, sort of similar on capital projects. That's my mantra: organize together with community leaders on the outside, focus on what matters, bring the data to it, and then just stick doggedly with it until change is made. And it's not easy, but that's the work.
So we're running out of time, 30 seconds. There's stuff we didn't get to, of course, and we can't get to everything even in 30 minutes, but want to give you a chance to highlight one more thing we didn't talk about. If there's anything that you're pledging to change about the controller's office or about the city, throw one more highlight in there in our last few seconds here.
Sure. We've just released a great plan to refocus our city's affordable housing program around what we call social housing. Right now, 80% of our subsidy dollars for affordable housing go to for-profit private developers who we then have to wrestle just to keep the housing affordable. I want to shift back to more things like Mitchell-Lama cooperatives, nonprofit affordable and supportive housing developers, community land trusts who build permanently affordable housing that enable the New Yorkers who really need it most to get affordable housing and to build wealth for the future. I've put out a detailed plan for how to do that and what the Comptroller's office can contribute.
Okay, Brad Lander is running for New York City Comptroller in the Democratic primary. Thank you very much for taking the time with us.
Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate it.
And thank you for watching Decision NYC with Ben Max. Key decisions for New York City voters are coming up in the June primaries and fall general election. There's a lot on the line for all of us in the future of the city. I hope this conversation and others are helpful to you as you get ready to vote. I'm Ben Max. See you next time.